Hi, my name is Leslie, and I live in Virginia.
Hi, I'm Michael in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Hi, my name is Henry.
Hi, this is Christian from Texas.
Hi, this is Pete.
Hi, this is Kristen from Sacramento.
When people reach out to us with questions,
I'm wondering how polling works.
I'm curious about polling in general.
I have a question about polling data.
My question is about polling methodologies.
one of the things they ask about most is polling.
Is polling still relevant?
Have the polling tactics changed since 2020?
How do pollsters reach out to people? Is it via cell phone? Is it text, links, things like that?
A lot of younger voters don't have landlines or reliably answer their phone. How do you get a reliable poll sample from this population?
I know a lot of pre-election hype is based on the polls, but I don't know anyone in my circles at least, and I sure haven't been part of poll questions. Thanks.
We're still weeks away from Super Tuesday, and usually around this time in the primary season, most of the attention when it comes to polling is around who's going to capture the nomination. But this year, with the race all but set, we're looking at 9 months of polling on two men we already know very well. Today, and by popular demand, how exactly does polling work? And what can we expect from it this year? From the New York Times, I'm Ested Herndon. This is The Run-Up.
So we're doing a poll in 2 weeks.
The last time the New York Times did a poll, my colleague Caitlin tagged along with the Times polling team. Nate Cohn, Will Davis, and Ruth Egelnick to get an inside look on how it works.
I guess my main question for you is, what are the types of questions you wish were being asked, you don't see being asked? Like, what are the areas where you would like to probe public opinion on the Trump trials?
First, the team sat down with reporters and editors across the newsroom.
I'm interested, as a baseline, if people even care all that much about them and who cares more than others. I don't know how you phrase that question, but
That's okay. We can work that out.
And asked them what they were curious about. Then, they met as a team.
So, things we want to ask, don't want to ask. With a tiered system, right? Ask on both, ask only on web.
To figure out how to best translate the things people wanted to know.
But if we're aiming for a 12-minute, I think we said 12 minutes for phone. So we're probably aiming for 30-ish substantive questions, maybe 25.
Into pollable questions.
Will and I talked to Alan Fewer, who covers the Trump trials, and I think it would be good to ask some version of kind of a comparison between these four trials.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different dimensions here, right? There's did he do it? Did he not do it? Is this a crime? Is it not a crime? Is it very bad versus not so bad?
They had hours of meetings.
We can definitely argue. I mean, we've argued about wording for hours, but I think that we're on a timetable that let's get everything in place and then know how much time we have to argue about wording.
Yeah, Monday and Tuesday will be our waiting arguing days.
Yeah.
This one needs work still, the nominee.
If Donald Trump wins those votes, he should still be the Republican nominee, even if it's a crime. There's too many ifs, potentially, but that's the...
Well, we can play with it.
Once the questions were finalized, my colleague Caitlin drove up to Siena College in upstate New York.
And we're going this door.
This door?
Siena partners with the Times to conduct its polling.
So we are located in the residence hall.
Okay, sure.
It turns out the Siena College Research Institute.
Down here, the double doors.
Are there students who live in here? Okay.
Second, third, and fourth floor. So you'll hear basketballs through the ceiling.
Is located in the dorm basement.
Smoke alarm will go off from things that they shouldn't be doing inside.
And down the hall from a laundry room.
So this is our call center. In here we have 34 individual call stations, and so folks are working in here, and each person is sitting there at their screen.
It's the call center where the poll goes out.
And they're given an assigned phone number. And
the people there were a mix.
I'm Caitlin.
Hi, Caitlin. Nice to meet you. I'm Lynn.
What are your names?
I'm Rebecca.
I'm Catherine.
I'm Denise.
Sam.
Charlotte Wilkins.
There were students, locals, and some experienced callers. They were all having a pretty common experience.
Hi, this is Sam calling from Siena College Research Institute. We're speaking briefly today to voters in your area and no one will try to sell you anything. Is this a safe time to talk with you? Are you sure your opinion is valued and it won't take long? Okay, thank you. So there, she didn't want to.
Did she say why?
She was like, I don't know who you are, so I don't want to talk to you. I was like, okay.
How long have you guys been here today, and like how many hang-ups or like people who haven't answered the phone have you had?
I've been here for about 2 hours and I think I've gone through like 160 calls and only one person finished the survey.
Wow.
They were getting a lot of answering machines, or just people saying flat out no. That's for reasons you'd expect. People generally don't have landlines anymore, and they often don't answer unknown numbers. The director of Siena's Research Institute says that 12 years ago, callers might have averaged 4 completed surveys an hour in national polls like these. Now, the average is more like 1 completed survey every 2 hours.
Out of 182 calls so far today, this is my 112th answer machine.
292 calls and then like 5 completed in the span of it.
What are the secrets to being a great poll caller?
I think being patient, and I think you have to be friendly. You know, you are just a voice, and you know, if you sound aggressive or blue bossy, people hang up on you anyway. But when they hear that, they will definitely hang up. So I think it's just try to be as friendly with people and understanding, and try not to lead them. So
I always say hello, good evening. Hi, my name is Charlotte. And I always say their first name. Oh, hi, Tracy. This is Charlotte. I'm calling from Siena College. Just not monotoned, but sounding engaging.
In the beginning, I was like, do you have time for me to ask you a few questions? And people would be like, no. So now I just go, hi, my name's Catherine. So this is the first question. And you just kind of go into it. Because if you give them the choice, they think, I don't really want to do this. And they put the phone down. So
I used to have someone who worked here who'd said nobody begged better than I did. Because I would be like, just talk to me just for a little while,
Yeah, it's been cool. Sometimes we feel like we're in like the Wolf of Wall Street and there's like people speaking, they're like, no, and we're just like going at it, and then it goes through dips where it's really quiet and everyone's not answering, but it's really rewarding when someone answers.
It's like you get so many endorphins when it's like, I don't know.
Hello, thank you so much. Can you answer this question? Yeah. By the end of the survey, you feel like you've gone on this whole journey. You're like, thank you, you made my whole night. But you just have to keep it professional and be like, yeah, cool, thank you so much for your cooperation.
But there's so often you want to like talk back to them because they have like so much to say, but you can't like
engage,
converse.
You can't go off the
you're like,
script.
okay, next question. Like this.
Sometimes they're like making jokes or they're being like, yeah, what do you think? And you have to be like, no, what do you think? This is not about me.
Eventually, Caitlin did get the chance to listen to someone take the survey.
So thinking ahead to next year's presidential general election, are you almost certain that you will vote, very likely that you will vote, somewhat likely, not very likely, or not at all likely?
I'm certain that I'll vote.
Almost certain. Amazing, thank you. If the 2024 presidential election were held today, who would you vote for if the candidates were Donald Trump, the Republican, or Joe Biden, the Democrat?
Joe Biden.
Thank you. Thinking generally about the criminal cases against Trump, which comes closer to your view, even if neither's exactly right. The charges against Donald Trump are mostly politically motivated, or Donald Trump was charged mostly because prosecutors believed he committed crimes?
I mean, they know he committed a crime. He's already been charged.
Okay, so you would say charged because prosecutors believed he committed crimes?
Because he committed a crime. He committed crimes.
Perfect. So thinking about the investigations into Donald Trump, do you think Donald Trump has or hasn't?
When the poll results came out in late December, here were some of the headlines. Trump was leading Biden, 46% to 44% among registered voters. But among likely voters, Biden was leading Trump, 47% to 45%. Also, a majority of respondents had an unfavorable view of both Trump and Biden. And 62% of Republicans thought if Trump won the Republican primary, he should remain the party's nominee, even if subsequently convicted of a crime. And all of this does help us understand the electorate. But it doesn't answer the question of if and why you should trust the polls, and what the polling team is going to be trying to answer in the coming year. So, Nate, I'm so glad we're back. How you doing?
Well, how are you? Good to see you.
It's good to see you too. Thank you for... I got on the phone with Nate Cohn, the Times chief political analyst who covers elections and polling. And I asked him, how can we trust poll results when there's so many people who just hang up?
Well, trust is a really interesting word to use, and look, we work for the New York Times, and the standard for what it means to trust our journalism is like super high, right? Like we present ourselves as providing something like an objective truth to readers, true facts. And the truth is polling does not reach that standard. And it never has. Even when response rates were very high, polls are random samples. They're fuzzy statistics that are deeply imperfect and subject to all different kinds of error. And so if your standard for what it means to trust a poll is what it usually means to trust New York Times journalism, what it usually means to say you trust something, that you can really count on it to be right, like the frustrating answer is you cannot trust polling by that standard, right? What you can do, though, I think, is learn quite a bit. And you can learn quite a bit from polling, even though it's deeply imperfect. Even to take the recent elections, as bad as polls were in 2020 and 2016, the national polls were only off by 3.5 points in 2020 and 2 points in 2016. Now, in an era of close elections, 3.5 and 2 points is like a lot. It's a difference between victory and defeat, or in 2020's case, between a landslide and a fairly close race. But it gets you in the ballpark for a lot of things. Like, for Biden's approval rating, whether he's at 37 or 40.5%, 3.5 point difference. Is it really a huge difference for our understanding of the country? Probably not, So I think that there's a lot we can get from polling, even stipulating that it's as imperfect as it is, and even as imperfect as it's been to earn the reputation of being outright bad. Now, I think that it's still fair to ask, how do we even know it's in the ballpark when response rates are this low? How do we reach voters in an era when people screen their calls, myself included, if it's from an unknown number? I haven't taken a poll in years. Last time I took a poll was in 2008 over summer in college because I had nothing to do pacing around in my old childhood bedroom. It was about the Bill Gates Foundation. Anyway, I think these are.
I love that you remember the last time. I was trying to think if I've been in the poll.
It's the only time I've ever done it. Anyway, these are legitimate questions, and we have a mix of evidence that tells us that this stuff is still useful. Some of it's based on hard research. In 2022, we did this really expensive study of Wisconsin where we mailed voters financial incentives to take a poll and got 30% of people to take that survey, and ran a telephone phone poll in parallel that had a 1% response rate. And the answers were basically the same. So the differences between this group of people who takes a telephone poll and the broader population may not be that great. And then on an individual poll-by-poll basis, we can scrutinize the poll based on the handful of facts that we do have. Does it have the right number of Democrats or Republicans by party registration? Does it have the right number of young people and old people? Does it have the right number of, white voters or black voters and so on? And those characteristics help give us confidence as well. None of it adds up to being perfect. None of it adds up to being objective fact, but it does add up to being useful.
Right. If we are talking about why are we still finding it useful, there's a number of examples both in the past and in the present that give us a good example. I mean, if I remember correctly, y'all's 2022 polling was pretty accurate reflection of the midterm results, right?
It was. I mean, we were on average, I think, off by less than 2 points across the 13 different races that we polled. Not perfect, but believe it or not, it's actually the best result of all time by any pollster with more than 10 polls in a cycle.
Hey, I like it.
But even that's imperfect. Even that, if I told you beforehand we were within 2 points, I think a lot of you would be like, okay, 2 points, not bad. Not perfect, but not bad.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of purposes for which that'll be really great. And there are others, if this is a super close presidential election, where 2 points will tell you nothing more than that it's close.
Well, in that reality, what do you then see as the value add to the polling that the New York Times and these other institutions are going to engage in?
I think the basic thing that polling tries to do in a democratic society is tell all kinds of political actors, and I'm defining that super broadly to involve just ordinary voters, of course, but also sometimes literally politicians, where the public is at on the issues and the candidates. And that information winds up cycling into the democratic process in all sorts of ways, because the democracy is supposed to, respond to the will of the people in all kinds of contexts. And some of those contexts are like super specific. Like, does Joe Biden need to change his stance on Israel and Palestine in order to appeal to young voters? And like, there are going to be people who are in the Biden campaign and Democrats across the country who are going to have to make a strategic decision, basically, about how to balance their own personal views on the issues against the sort of tactical or strategic imperatives for a campaign. Polling is like the number one way that those calculations sort of get made. And it's true for someone, whether they're deciding whether to put an initiative on the ballot, which kind of primary candidate they're going to vote for, which candidates they should give money to, what messages a campaign should have, and sometimes what policies they should support. And polling doesn't need to know in many cases whether Biden is up 2 or tied or down 2 for that purpose, right? A lot of those answers can be, resolved with the fuzzy statistics that we have.
Mm-hmm.
To take Israel and Palestine among young voters, like Biden's disapproval rating among young voters on this issue is like well over 70% in most polls. Maybe it's off by 5 points. Maybe it's 70. Maybe it's 80. Either way, we know what we need to know. And, whether you like polling playing that role or not, and I can think of a lot of different reasons why polling is an imperfect fit for that. That's the way democracy works when we have competitive elections in order to decide the exercise of political power.
Yeah. I mean, so many campaigns will say, oh, we're not worried about the polls. But I think we and you both know, I mean, they do.
Do they worry about the polls?
They worry about polls massively. They think about them all the time. It shapes decisions, to your point, but it also just shapes narratives too. And I think we shouldn't leave media outside of this. Also, polling is a big driver of the coverage.
Definitely.
So you have this both yearning incentive for polling, both from political junkies or media or candidates. And you also have this growing skepticism, I think, among regular people who really just, I think, have become increasingly skeptical that polling is a value or useful, specifically when it comes to looking for the result. How do you balance that kind of hunger for more polling, more numbers, a reaction to kind of every piece of new information, and what does seem to be the kind of baseline growing skepticism among regular folks?
I mean, one interesting thing that's just worth flagging here is, like, I really don't, like, predict election results. I know people think of polling as being a way to predict elections, which it totally is. But, like, we're just taking, a measure of the public. And it's never been precise, as I mentioned. And the polls can always be wrong. And what I try and do is have articles and takeaways that, reflect those two facts.
Yeah.
We're always going to, talk as much as we can about the limitations of the polling and how it could be wrong. And the cycle will be no exception. We haven't gotten close enough to the heart of the race for us to write all the things about why the polls could be wrong yet. Even though we're already sort of prematurely in the heart of the polling season because the candidates are decided earlier than usual and so on. But that's all we can really do is be as honest about it as we can be.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a couple more kind of polling, logistic, tactical questions, and then we'll get to the race itself. With Trump on the ballot, does that change any way that you all have to go about polling?
It's a really good question. I think the short answer is no. Like, I don't think the fundamentals of what we're doing change. My concern is that it may make our lives more challenging. I think I'm concerned that Donald Trump has appealed to many of the kinds of voters who are least likely to participate in surveys, like people who are disengaged and disaffected from American politics, people who distrust the media. The reason it doesn't change how we poll is because we are always trying to adjust for all three of those things, right? We're always trying to make sure we have a representative sample, including in many cases along precisely the dimensions of potential bias that Trump has sort of exacerbated potentially in his time in public life. So I guess what I would say is, like, it doesn't change how we poll, but I think it does increase, like, the risks to polling. I mean, there's no way around the fact that the two worst elections that polling has had in, our lifetimes were with Trump on the ballot.
Mm-hmm.
And that he happens to appeal to many of the kinds of people who are less likely to take polls.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a risk that we have heading into this election. Now, Trump's ahead in the polls right now, so maybe that means that those factors are less acute at the moment. Maybe it means that Trump's actually up even more than the polls show right now. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a risk.
Does that, worry you? Does that, keep you up any, or is it just the reality of what y'all are facing?
I mean, of course it worries us. Unlike one of the funny things is that not only are the polls not, objective facts by the standard of ordinary New York Times journalism we talked about, there's also a scoreboard at the end.
Yeah.
And the things that mess up the polls in elections are always different. Like, even if we perfectly accounted for the things that went wrong in the last election, something new could do it this time. And just take an example. If Trump gets convicted of a crime, like, am I concerned that a lot of Republican voters are going to start saying they're undecided or voting for a third-party candidate in the polls? And once they get into the ballot box, vote for Donald Trump? Yeah, I'm worried about that. That could happen. There are all kinds of things that can happen.
And those are earnest things that can happen. That's not like polling missing something. That's a reality of how people go through these type of decisions. And so I understand it. I kind of, I feel for the reality of that, what you all have to face. To that point, we want to talk about some of the findings that you all have had and just lay out kind of the state of the race for us as we kind of transition to this new period. I wanted to start, though, with one question about the Democratic and Republican primaries, respectively. On the Republican side, starting with Nikki Haley, when we last talked last year, you said that there was just no universe in which you thought a Haley versus Trump one-on-one matchup would end with anyone other than Trump. Obviously, we have arrived to this point now. Is there anything, evidence you've had that would change that opinion?
No. I mean, I don't want to go and say, oh, I was right or something, but like, yeah, it's not going to happen. Even if Nikki Haley wins like Vermont or something, this isn't going to happen. It's her, her appeal is too narrow, and this is a populist conservative party, and she's running a moderate, establishment-friendly candidacy. It's just doesn't line up.
Yeah. I mean, it's really helpful that like the clarity is still there, because throughout the whole year, obviously, folks are going up and down, and I was like, I don't know. It seems to be a math issue.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask about the Democratic side, though, also. Biden is himself cruising to the Democratic nomination. He beat Dean Phillips handily with the write-in campaign in New Hampshire. He just got a huge percentage of the vote out in South Carolina. And one of the questions I've heard from people is, how are we supposed to take those primary results and fit them into the general election picture that we're seeing? Does the fact that he's beaten the person who's making the age argument in New Hampshire mean he doesn't have a problem with age? Does the fact that he got a big percentage with black voters in South Carolina means he doesn't have a potential problem with black voters in the general? How are we supposed to put the New Hampshire and South Carolina Democratic results in perspective?
I mean, to be blunt, I think it's basically irrelevant. And there are two reasons for that. I mean, one, this wasn't a competitive race. The turnout was extremely small. It's just not reflective of even the normal presidential primary electorate. I mean, to take South Carolina, the turnout for this presidential primary was lower than the 2022 Senate primary. I mean, can anyone here name? I mean, if you can name who was on the ballot in that contest to face Tim Scott in the general, and people showed up for that in greater numbers than this. That tells you a lot about whether you're really tapping in to the sort of real electorate. But it's really one of the big dividing lines in our polling over the last year, is that the sort of Democrats who regularly participate in elections, who have ideologically consistent views on the issues, are sticking with Joe Biden, and the Democrats who don't regularly participate in elections are a big problem for him right now.
More after the break. So it seems like we're okay then to look ahead to the general election. I want to make sure that you agree with that.
Let's go.
But I also want to, it sounds good that you agree with that. But I guess because these are two candidates that seem most familiar, tell me, like, what do the data sets already tell us about Trump versus Biden part two in a way that we wouldn't have had that much information about two candidates from the start at this point? What are some things that we know?
Almost everyone knows these two candidates, and we've literally already had an election with them. So we know a lot about the contours of this race. I mean, first, the big thing that's changed since 2020, though, is that Joe Biden has gone from being popular to not popular. Back in 2020, 50+% of Americans said they had a favorable view of Joe Biden, and now about 42% do. And that is a pretty big change in the basic contours of the race. In 2020, Joe Biden ran as the sort of broadly appealing and acceptable candidate who could win all of the people, of which there were many, who didn't want Donald Trump to be president. And instead, we now have an election where there's a large group of voters who don't like either candidate. And the polling says that this group of voters who has soured on Joe Biden over the last few years is disproportionately young, Black, Latino, and less likely to be regular voters in elections. Mm-hmm. It's a very simple story in a way to have this group of voters go from liking Joe Biden to not. They don't like Donald Trump still, though some of them are now willing to say that they'll vote for him, at least in a poll 9 months out. Whether that holds up, we'll see. But it actually sets up a fairly simple nexus question from the standpoint of the polling, which is what happens over the next 9 months to this group of voters who liked Joe Biden, or at least accepted Joe Biden last time, and now doesn't, and is currently registering their dissatisfaction with Joe Biden by either refusing to vote for him in a poll or even outright being willing to support Donald Trump.
I mean, it does feel to me that Trump 2024 is much more focused on winning over Black and Latino voters, is much more focused on young voters. And it sees that drop off of Biden as a way to kind of pull back a little more of a multicultural working class set of the electorate than they had the ability to, or even seemed to be focused to do in 2016 or 20. Is there anything in the numbers that reflects that? Because that's my sense of their political strategy and intention.
I think you're definitely right about the strategy. I think the numbers only offer equivocal support for the idea that Trump's actually improved his own popularity among these groups. There's a little bit of positive movement for Trump favorability-wise since 2020 among the demographic groups that we're talking about. Just how seriously to take that, 9 months from the election among precisely the kind of voters who aren't paying that much attention yet, by definition, I just don't know.
Right. That's what we should track over the next several months.
That's exactly what we're going to track. And, I have to be honest, this is not one of the most interesting general elections that I feel like I have covered before. We've literally done this already.
Literally.
And we're watching sort of weaker versions of these candidates coming back. It's going to be a little bit painful for everyone, including the voters. And I think that the problem that will create is that because the overwhelming sense of voters will be to register their dissatisfaction with their choice, that it may be difficult for us to detect whatever positive changes have sort of occurred. And I do think it's conceivable that there will be real positive changes for Trump that we're just going to sort of miss here. To take one example, the 2016 campaign was sort of defined by Donald Trump saying, racist things about immigrants and Mexicans and so on. And that's not so far the way he's campaigned in 2024. Right. But I don't feel like we have a poll question that will neatly pick up that thing that was hurting him before isn't hurting him. These people still don't like him in a lot of cases. So what do you, to the extent he's doing better, he's gone from being unacceptably horrible to just we still don't like him and still wish he wasn't around, but maybe we can vote for him now. And that's a hard thing to pick up for us.
Yeah. I mean, what you lay out has a lot of threads that are important for us to look forward and follow up on kind of journalistically. But more than anything, you describe a type of person that's really familiar to the type of people we talk to on the road. People who may not know exactly about policies, people who are shocked to learn that Biden versus Trump would even be a possibility.
It is shocking, in fairness to them.
They're shocked. And so it's much more of a hodgepodge, and particularly for the type of people who are going to most matter for this election, it's not really clear, if there is a single silver bullet policy thing, that's the answer here.
Oh, yeah. So just to entirely agree with you on your first point, I mean, once you start getting into the voters who don't turn out in midterms and only turn out in generals, or maybe sometimes don't vote in presidential elections, that voter just bears no resemblance to you, dear listener. If you care enough to be listening to the show, you are not the voter we're talking about. And then to your second point about policy, I mean, I think that's one of the most interesting things about the challenge that may or may not face Joe Biden going forward. Joe Biden wants to win this election mostly on a set of serious issues like abortion and democracy, and clearly those issues resonate among the partisan and ideological voters who turn out in midterms and primaries. And it remains to be seen, I think, whether that's the best way to reach the kind of voters that we're talking about right now. It may be that it is. It may be that once they tune in and they hear these arguments, they will be just as receptive to it as everyone else. But it's also possible that these voters are disengaged precisely because those aren't the kinds of issues that they care about. And that if they were the kind of person that cares about abortion, they would have voted last November, to take an example. It may be that those voters care much more about the superficial stuff where maybe Joe Biden has some serious problems, like just the perception of whether he's capable of handling the job given his age. The perception that the economy isn't doing well, that prices are still high, that the cost of housing is higher, that all of this creates just this backdrop of dissatisfaction. And maybe that'll fade or maybe not. But it makes perfect sense to me that this group of people is potentially being driven by an entirely different set of ideas and sentiments and so on than the higher turnout electorate.
I've seen you write about the distinction between likely and registered voters that was showing up in some polling. Does that distinction in the data speak to any of what we're talking about here? And how might that matter for Biden in November?
Yeah, I mean, right now, as I've just mentioned, Biden is weak among these voters who don't regularly vote in elections, right? It's worth noting it's not simply that he's holding his own among higher turnout voters. He's actually looking better than 2020 among the highest turnout voters. Like, there are Republican voters out there and independents who voted for Donald Trump last time, but who are upset about abortion, upset about democracy. And they're just like, no, I'm not doing Trump again after January 6th. You see these people in New Hampshire turning out for Nikki Haley. So at the top of the electorate, these most likely voters, Joe Biden is probably doing better than he was 4 years ago, at least in our data. And so when we look forward to November and we narrow ourselves to this narrower pool of voters we believe will turn out in the general election, as compared to the broader group of registered voters, that group is ever so slightly better for Biden because you've lost some of these dissenting low turnout voters, and those high turnout voters that are Biden's strength represent a greater proportion of the 2020 general electorate. Now, oddly enough, if Biden winds up recovering among low turnout young Black and Latino voters, then the difference between the likely voter polls and the registered voter polls may shrink a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. But for now, with Biden's weakness concentrated among less likely voters, he might be doing better among the actual voting electorate of likely voters, or the likely electorate of likely voters, than among the group of registered voters who you see in most polls right now.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point. It also kind of strikes, though, at the Democratic, I think, language that, small d democracy, more people voting possible is better for them. I mean, somewhat you're describing is that the farther this electorate expands out might include more people who are dissatisfied with Biden.
Yeah, I mean, at least right now, the issues that seem to really alarm voters and determine whether someone is going to walk on glass in order to get to the polls, that those are issues like democracy, abortion, and opposition to Trump that drives Biden's strength among this high turnout group of voters that he can really count on. And as a consequence, the smaller the electorate is and the more you narrow down to the people who are willing to walk on glass, the better Biden is doing. Mm-hmm. And so you're right that right now, Democrats may do worse if hypothetically everyone voted, which is unusual. It's certainly not what was true 10 years ago. I don't even think it was true 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. But at least right now, with this combination of Democratic strength among the highest turnout voters and weakness among the lowest turnout voters, I think you're right that there's a chance that Biden would do worse if everyone voted.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a couple walk-on glass issues, abortion, democracy protection. I wanted to say, what are the other top issues you see as worth focusing on and most curious about? I'm thinking about Trump's legal cases, or, you mentioned the kind of economic indicators. What are some of the things that we should be most focused on outside of issues of abortion or democracy?
You just mentioned two good ones. The economy, obviously important, especially to voters who are less concerned about, ideological issues, who may be precisely the voters who Biden is weak among right now. The trials of Donald Trump, mm-hmm. That's potentially a huge issue. I mean, the range of possibilities goes all the way from him being acquitted to being in jail potentially, right? I mean, and we have no idea what kind of effect any of that will have. It would not surprise me if a conviction is enough to deter a sliver of voters from supporting him in the general election, and that could easily be decisive in a close race. I'd put what's going on in the Middle East on this list as well.
Yeah,
we
certainly
talked about Biden being weak among a disproportionately young and non-white group, and that's also a group that is likeliest to oppose Biden's support for Israel's conduct in Gaza and the West Bank. So that's reinforcing his weakness, and in some cases, maybe turning a weakness into a serious electoral problem among perhaps especially Muslim and Arab voters, or perhaps just the most far left voters who now see Biden as complicit in genocide potentially. Those are big words. Like, if you really believe that this is complicity in genocide, it should be no surprise to think that voter might not be willing to vote for Biden anymore if you really take them at their word on that, right? So that's potentially a very serious issue, given that Biden may already be weak among the groups in question. It's worth talking about the issues that are favorable to Republicans, too. Immigration and the border, a huge one.
Yeah, I was going to mention, I'm sure immigration's driving the other side.
I think that it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, including what's going on the Hill right now. Like, I'm not even sure how Biden was supposed to defend himself on this issue as of a month ago. Like, if he was talking to a skeptical voter on the border, I'm not even sure what he was supposed to say to reassure them, given the way that they've handled it to this point, both from a policy and a messaging standpoint. I just felt like they didn't have anything that they could say that they were saying to defend themselves. Now they have this interesting opportunity to run against Republican obstruction on the border. And that'll be an interesting change to like the rhetorical landscape here. And I think Joe Biden's age also has to be mentioned here. It's in some ways, it's the most obvious issue. You know, the guy is over 80 years old. Voters overwhelmingly say he's too old to be president. We've never had someone this old running for office and who so many people say is too old to be president. Is that really the core of all of these problems that Joe Biden has? It's possible as we tick off these issues one by one, as the economy gets better, as the immigration deal maybe helps his position on that issue. If we're still looking at Trump in the lead at that point, that's going to be the one where it's like, maybe this is a horse who can't win the horse race because he's too old now.
Yeah, and maybe it's not a message problem. It's a messenger problem.
We may come to that point if everything keeps breaking well and Biden continues to trail. And that's also one that's just, it's so unusual and different from what we've seen before that it could be extremely important. And it's just hard to predict whether that's the sort of thing voters can or can't accept.
Mm-hmm. You know, one last question I have is the thing I'm really obsessed with this year is the issue of voter apathy. With so many people who don't want either of the two options, being Trump or Biden, what are they going to do? Are they going to vote for a third party? Are they going to not vote at all? Do people just begrudgingly back one of those two candidates? Is there some way one of those candidates can make themselves newly appeal to someone? I guess I wanted to pose that to you. Like, how would you look to track the question of apathy and disengagement or engagement in this year's election? And do you think that that apathy is really the right word to track what we've seen in polling as that candidate distaste?
Yeah, I don't think of it as apathy exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I do think of it more as distaste, as you put at the end there, or dissatisfaction. I mean, you can be a highly engaged voter who does not want either of these candidates. And based on the polling, there are a lot of voters who don't want either of these candidates. And the thing about the phrase voter apathy is it makes it sound like it's about the voters not caring rather than about like the system providing choices that are deeply unpalatable to a large segment of Americans, right? And I do think that, you know, that is probably more of what we're seeing right now. And you're totally right that, you know, how much support third parties get in this election is going to be a huge question potentially. I mean, we're sort of all avoiding this huge elephant in the room with RFK Jr. because we don't know if he's going to be on the ballot yet. But if the polls are right, he would probably start over 10%. And, you know, maybe he'll lose all that support as the stakes become clear. But that measure alone is such a telling indication of how many voters are dissatisfied with the traditional choices right now. We also have the question of whether voters dislike both candidates. I think that the double haters, as people like to refer to them as colloquially, I think that's a fun group to hone in on. Are these people actually going to vote? Do they say they're going to vote? Are they voting for RFK? Are they undecided? That group of voters who don't like both candidates, I think, is a really important one. But like the thing about voting in a presidential election is like with all of the early voting and all the absentee voting and all the media attention, like if you really care about the election, you end up voting. Mm-hmm. There are undoubtedly some people who don't vote, who wanted to vote, but it's a small number of people in these sort of elections compared to others. And the thing that determines turnout is whether you care enough to vote, whether there's someone who you want to get up and you know, go to the polls for or not. And that'll be the question as far as turnout is concerned, is whether people are sufficiently motivated either by their love for one of the candidates or, if not, the depth of their hatred for the other.
Mm-hmm. Right. I phrased it as apathy, but I think distaste is really right because that is really what we're up against. Like an election where voters are very clearly stating this isn't what they wanted, but this is the reality.
Yeah, and we had an election like this before in 2016, and it was a more volatile cycle. There were huge numbers of undecided voters. Gary Johnson, for a time, you may remember, was polling in the high single digits. Mm-hmm. There are people who think that the minor party vote even decided that election. And it's certainly a possibility that something like that could happen again.
Mm. Well, to the craziness ahead, like between the work that you're doing, the work that we're doing, like it's going to be Is it going to be fun?
What's the word you were going to say? Fun? Is that the word?
Yeah, I was going to say fun, and then I almost stopped myself. Will it? You tell me.
Honestly, I don't think it's going to be fun. Not necessarily anymore. We are very lucky, I think, to have the jobs that we have. But and there's a lot about our jobs that's tons of fun. But look, the substance of this election it's literally an election we've had before, except we have sort of worse versions of the candidates coming back. And it's all against the backdrop of extremely, dire and serious stakes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ested.
That's the run-up for Thursday, February 8th, 2024. And now, the rundown.
The Nevada primary did not get a lot of attention. Did it turn into an embarrassment?
Even though she was the only major candidate on the ballot, Nikki Haley lost the Nevada Republican primary on Tuesday, capturing just around 30% of the vote. The overwhelming winner of the primary was the option that read, none of these candidates, which received over 63% of the votes.
The outcome in Nevada is now Haley's third consecutive loss in an early state primary contest. Still, her campaign says her results in Nevada won't affect how long she stays in the race, with her focus now aimed at South Carolina and beyond.
Today, the Nevada caucuses will take place, and the winner will take the state's delegates. As we explored in Tuesday's Nevada-focused episode, it's all but certain to go to Donald Trump. And in a shakeup to the Republican National Committee, Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel is reportedly preparing to step down from her post after the South Carolina primary later this month. During her tenure, McDaniel has faced competing pressures in the party, both from a skeptical Trump base and the GOP establishment. Plus,
a federal appeals court dealing a major legal blow to former President Donald Trump.
On Tuesday, a panel of appeals court judges unanimously rejected Donald Trump's claim of absolute immunity in the federal election interference case against him. In a 57-page ruling, the judges wrote, for the purposes of this criminal case, former President Trump has become Citizen Trump.
The decision is now opening the way for special counsel Jack Smith to prosecute Trump on multiple charges, accusing him of trying to undermine the 2020 election.
Trump's team says it will appeal. There are 16 days until the South Carolina Republican primary and 271 days until the general election. We'll see you next week. The Run-Up is reported by me, Ested Herndon, and produced by Elisa Gutierrez, Caitlin O'Keefe, and Anna Foley. It's edited by Rachel Dry, Lisa Tobin, and Franny Kartoff, with original music by Dan Powell, Marian Lozano, Pat McCusker, Diane Wong, Sophia Landman, and Alicia Itu. It was mixed by Sophia Landman and fact-checked by Caitlin Love. Special thanks to Paula Schumann, Sam Dolnick, Larissa Anderson, David Haufinger, Maddie Masiello, Mahima Chablani, Jeffrey Miranda, Ruth Egelnick, Will Davis, Nate Cohn, Don Levy, Travis Broadbeck, and the team at the Siena College Research Institute. Do you have a question about the 2024 election? Email us at therunup@nytimes.com, or better yet, record your question using the voice memo app on your phone, and then send us the file. The email again is therunup@nytimes.com. And finally, if you like the show and want to get updates on latest episodes, follow our feed wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, y'all.